In the Mojave Desert, there is a dry lake with no outlet. For roughly 50,000 years, water ran into it, evaporated, and left its minerals behind. What remains is a bed of brine so concentrated that a company built an entire town on top of it. But in February 2026, that company switched off the furnaces that had run for a century, and in June it filed for bankruptcy, not because the lake ran out and not because anyone did anything wrong. The mineral was still there. Roughly 100 years of it by the company's own reckoning. What had disappeared was the price. This is the story of Searles Valley Minerals, a business sitting on a resource that cannot be exhausted in any human time frame, killed by the one number it did not control. First, what the place actually is, because the geology is the business. Searles Lake sits in San Bernardino County, California, at the bottom of a closed basin. Rain and snowmelt from the surrounding ranges carry dissolved minerals down into it, and because there is no river out, nothing leaves except water vapor. Over tens of thousands of years, that cycle concentrated the brine into something extraordinarily rich: sodium carbonate, borates, sodium sulfate, salt, all in solution, all stacked in layers. People have been pulling minerals out of it since the 1870s, when borax was hauled out of the desert by wagon. The company in its modern corporate form dates to 1913. The town of Trona grew up beside the plant, and for most of a century the arrangement was simple. The lake supplied the chemistry, the plant supplied the processing, and the town supplied the workers. That word arrangement is doing more work than it looks like. This was not a factory that happened to have a town nearby. The company owned the railway that carried the product out of the valley, and it owned the utility that delivered water to the houses. Those are not side businesses. In a place with no river, no highway commerce, and no second employer, they are the infrastructure of daily life, and they sat on the same balance sheet as the furnaces. Which means that when the filing came, it did not come alone. The bankruptcy petition covered the mineral company, and separately the railway company, and separately the water company. A single price, set on the other side of the world, reached all the way down to who supplies a desert town with drinking water. That is what it means for a place to have one employer. The main product was soda ash sodium carbonate. It is one of those substances that almost nobody thinks about and almost everybody depends on. It goes into glass. It goes into detergent. It goes into paper, into water treatment, into the manufacture of other chemicals. It is not a luxury good and it is not a technology. It is an input bought by the ton, and the only thing a buyer really cares about is the price per ton. That last sentence is the whole story. There are two ways to make soda ash. You can synthesize it in a chemical plant, which is how most of the world does it. Or you can extract it from natural deposits, which is what the United States does, and the American natural deposits, including this one, were long considered among the cheapest sources on Earth. For decades, that was a durable advantage. Natural soda ash undercut synthetic soda ash, and a plant sitting on a nearly inexhaustible brine lake had a structural reason to exist. Then the world built more capacity. Over the 2020s, enormous new soda ash production came online, much of it in China, and global supply moved ahead of global demand. When that happens to a commodity, the price does not drift down politely. It falls until the highest cost producers stop producing, because that is the only mechanism a commodity market has for balancing itself. The market does not ask who has been operating for a century. It asks who can deliver a ton for less. The company's own account is blunt about where that left it. It said that lower-cost soda ash from China was selling at prices that California-based producers could not reasonably match. And here the cost structure of this particular plant becomes decisive. Turning brine into dry soda ash is, at bottom, a boiling problem. You pump up the solution, you drive off the water, you crystallize what is left. That takes an enormous and continuous amount of heat. By the company's account, energy came to represent nearly half of the production cost of its soda ash and boric acid. Sit with that ratio because it explains why a price fall is fatal rather than merely painful. In a business where energy is half the cost, there is very little else to cut. You cannot negotiate your way out of physics. The water in the brine has to be evaporated, and evaporating it costs what it costs. A plant like that has almost no margin lever. When the selling price crosses below the cost of boiling, every additional ton produced makes the loss larger, not smaller. That is a fundamentally different position from the retailer who can trim inventory or the manufacturer who can shift a production line. The furnace is the business. Turning it down does not save the business. It ends it. The pressure did not arrive all at once, and it did not arrive only from the market. In July 2019, two large earthquakes struck near Ridgecrest, a short distance from the plant. Industrial facilities of this kind are long assemblies of pipe, tank, and rail, and shaking of that magnitude does not merely break things that can be replaced. It interrupts a continuous process that is expensive to restart and expensive to run below capacity. The company points to those earthquakes as part of a multi-year erosion of profitability, layered on top of a structural downturn in the soda ash market itself. So by the middle of the 2020s, the arithmetic looked like this. A global price falling toward the cost of the lowest cost producers on Earth, a plant whose cost was roughly half energy, and a physical operation still absorbing the aftermath of a serious seismic event. Production of soda ash had been declining since 2021. In February 2026, the company stopped making soda ash. The stated purpose was to preserve liquidity, which is the plainest possible admission that each additional ton was consuming cash rather than generating it. The same month, it announced the layoff of 300 employees, effective in April. In a small desert town built around a single plant, 300 jobs is not a line in a filing. Local reporting described it as the most severe economic blow the area had taken since a major downsizing in 1982. The comparison is worth understanding, because it tells you what kind of place this is. A town that measures its bad years against something that happened more than 4 decades earlier is a town where very little changes, which is another way of saying there is nowhere else to go. In a city, 300 jobs disperse into an economy. Here they were roughly the working population of the place. And the sequence matters. The furnaces went off in February, the layoffs took effect in April, the filing came in June. That is not a company collapsing overnight. That is a company shutting down in the order that costs the least cash, stop the loss-making production first, then the payroll it supported, then seek protection once the obligations that remain can no longer be met from what is left. Read forward, it looks like decline. Read backward, it looks like a controlled descent by people who could see the arithmetic and could not change it. On June 15, 2026, Searles Valley Minerals, Inc., and 2 of its wholly owned subsidiaries filed for Chapter 11 protection in the United States Bankruptcy Court for the District of Delaware. 2 affiliated entities filed as well. The Trona Railway Company, which moves the product out of the valley, and the Searles Domestic Water Company, which supplies water to the community. The corporate parent is Nirma Limited, an Indian manufacturing group, holding the business through an intermediate company. 2 details of the filing are worth pausing on, because they say something a balance sheet does not. The first is who put money in. Alongside a $20 million debtor-in-possession facility from the corporate parent's holding company, the filing describes a $20 million liquidity advance from Tata Chemicals, unsecured and interest-free. Tata Chemicals is itself a producer in this industry. A competitor extending $20 million with no security and no interest is not an act of charity, and it is not an ordinary trade credit. It is a signal that someone with deep knowledge of this market believes the underlying asset is worth keeping alive. The second is what the company is selling. The Chapter 11 is not a liquidation. It is a court-supervised sale under Section 363 of the Bankruptcy Code, run by the investment bank Lazard, aimed at selling substantially all of the assets to a new owner. Marketing had already begun in 2025. More than 140 parties contacted, roughly 50 of whom signed confidentiality agreements. The company is not trying to wind down a dead business. It is trying to hand a live one to somebody who can carry it. And what it is handing over is no longer primarily soda ash. The Argus plant is being mothballed. The Trona operation is being cut deeply. But the West End facility, which produces boron compounds, sodium sulfate, and salt, is intended to keep running. The company has been repositioning around borates as the soda ash market moved against it. That pivot matters more than it first appears, because boron was recently added to the United States Geological Survey's list of critical minerals. A critical mineral is one the country considers essential to its economy or security and vulnerable in its supply. Being on that list does not raise the price by itself. What it does is change who is paying attention. A domestic source of a critical mineral is strategically interesting in a way that a domestic source of a commodity glass ingredient is not. The difference between those two categories is not chemistry, it is concentration. Soda ash is made in many countries by many producers, which is exactly why its price collapsed when supply grew. No single source is hard to replace. Boron is the opposite. Economically viable deposits are rare and clustered in very few places on Earth. A buyer of soda ash has options. A buyer of boron has a short list. That is what makes the same lake worth something on Tuesday that it was not worth on Monday. Nothing was discovered. The borates were always in the brine, sitting beside the sodium carbonate, coming up in the same pumped solution. For a century, they were the smaller line of business, because the larger one paid better. When the larger one stopped paying, what had been a byproduct became the reason to keep the pumps running. Businesses rarely get to choose which of their assets the world decides to want. What they can choose is whether they still own the asset when the wanting arrives. And that is a question about surviving the interval, which is exactly what this company could not do on its own. So the asset going up for sale is not the business that failed. It is the part of the deposit the failure did not touch. It is worth being clear about what a sale like this does and does not settle. Section 363 lets a buyer take the assets largely free of the liabilities that came with them, which is precisely why buyers show up at all, and precisely why the people owed money before the filing tend to recover least. The lake changes hands. The debts mostly do not travel with it. For the town, that produces a strange kind of suspense. A liquidation would be an ending. The equipment sold piece by piece, the site abandoned, the question closed. A sale is not an ending. It is a transfer of the same physical plant, the same rail line, and the same water utility to somebody who has decided what parts of it are worth restarting. Everyone waits to find out which parts those are. And the buyer, whoever it turns out to be, will be buying at the bottom of a commodity cycle, acquiring for a fraction of replacement cost a deposit that took 50,000 years to concentrate and about a century to develop. That is not a comment on fairness. It is how distressed sales work, and it is why they attract the kind of buyer who can wait. What is there to take from this? The first lesson is the one that gets stated most often and understood least. Owning a resource is not owning a business. The lake is still full. The brine is still concentrated. By the company's own reckoning, there is something like a century of mineral left. None of that was ever the question. A resource only has value if somebody will pay more for the processed product than it costs to process, and that gap is set by a global market the owner does not participate in setting. The second is about cost structure, and it generalizes far past mining. When a single input is half your cost, you have effectively taken a position in that input's price, whether or not you ever intended to. The business here was nominally selling soda ash. Economically, it was long energy and short the global price of a commodity, a spread trade, run by a company whose stated purpose was making chemicals. Most businesses have one of these hidden positions somewhere. Very few name it. The third is about what a downturn actually selects for. A commodity price does not fall to punish bad management. It falls until enough production stops, and it takes the highest cost producers first in order, regardless of their history, their workforce, or how long they have been there. 100 years of operation buys no seniority in that queue. The plant did not close because it was run badly. It closed because it was expensive, at a moment when the world had more of what it made than it needed. And the fourth is the one the sale documents make quietly. The same deposit that could not survive as a soda ash producer may be worth a great deal as a source of something else. Nothing under the ground changed. What changed was which mineral the world had decided it could not do without. Disclaimer: this video is for educational and informational purposes only. All information is drawn from publicly available documents, including United States Bankruptcy Court, filings for the District of Delaware, company announcements, and reporting by credentialed news organizations. No allegation of wrongdoing of any kind is made against any individual or company. No individual has been charged with or convicted of any offense in connection with the events described. This is a commercial insolvency, not a legal case. Source links are available below.